Chinese growth. I think in addition to that, we have to recognize that there was a lot of transshipment out of China through other economies in the region to the US. So Vietnam is particularly vulnerable. Malaysia. So if you look at who are the largest exporters to the US in terms of where a US exports the largest share of GDP, it's Vietnam, it's Taiwan, it's Malaysia, it's Thailand, right? So you've got a number of economies here that are directly exposed. Now on the tariff threat, Tanvi, a lot depends on what is the motive behind tariffs. If the motive is to have a universal tariff, everyone gets impacted. If the motive is to try and correct bilateral trade imbalances, so more mercantilist, then if you line up the US, the 15 countries with which the US runs the largest trade imbalances, 9 of those are in Asia. And so Asia becomes very vulnerable. If the issue is reciprocity, that I just want to equalize tariffs, then countries like India and Thailand become more vulnerable. So depending on what the kind of modus operandi is in April 2nd, different countries in Asia are exposed to different degrees.
That's the whole problem, Sajjid. Right. Nobody knows what the issue is. Exactly. People are trying to figure out the issue.
It's the uncertainty, right? So even if the tariffs don't actually occur, I think the point from the last regime was it's the uncertainty that does the damage, right? And so you should expect to see, investment decisions around the world being delayed until this uncertainty is resolved. The last thing business wants at this point, coming out of a pandemic shock, coming out of a Russia-Ukraine conflict, is more uncertainty.
Is more uncertainty. And I'll add one more angle to that point. The thing is, President Trump has kept his cards close to his chest in terms of not giving out still very clearly whether this is a negotiating tactic or whether this is a very well carved out fiscal policy, right, to shore up budgeted revenues in the US. And so everybody's playing the guessing game.
And the uncertainty here is the feature, not the bug, right? Now, I think the question, the known unknown is that US will get hurt by the uncertainty itself, but the US potentially has offsets. And the offsets are that you have a larger fiscal impulse if you can get through large tax cuts, and B, if there's a big deregulation push in the US. So what one has to grapple with is two scenarios. One is global growth slows and US growth slows in tandem. But the second one is global growth slows because of the uncertainty. But remnants of US exceptionalism remain because the US can use its offsets, easier fiscal policy, more deregulation. That's the worst of all worlds for emerging markets because you're dealing with global growth. But because you've got remnants of US exceptionalism and the dollar remains bid, and US rates are high, that constrains the degrees of freedom for central banks in Asia. And we saw that play out in 2024, that Asia has been much below its pre-pandemic path for the last 2 years. Inflation has come back to target much sooner than other regions of the world. Asian central banks should have been cutting interest rates a year ago. But they were constrained from cutting rates because the dollar was elevated and US rates were high. And this is the classical trilemma that Asia is full of small open economies with open capital accounts. And there's a fear of excess floating. So what happens then is in some countries, monetary policy becomes hostage to the Fed.